For generations, we were told the Border Collie was a finished story, a pure breed carved out on the rugged Scottish border. But modern genetics just shattered that myth. When researchers finally sequenced the DNA, they didn't find one clear ancestor. They found something much more complicated and, frankly, uncomfortable. Today we're revealing what the DNA actually shows about the true ancestry of the Border Collie. By the time this breed became a recognizable name, the story around it already sounded complete. A hard-working dog, refined by shepherds, trusted wherever sheep had to be moved with precision. It was an elegant, easy explanation. But the historical trail was never as clean as that version suggested. If you're ready to dismantle the story you've been told, make sure to subscribe, because we're about to rewrite the history of your favorite working dog. We have a deep-seated human need for clean origins. It is a psychological bias we bring to everything, from our politics to our pets. We look at a Border Collie today, the way it locks onto a flock, the way it ignores the entire world to focus on a single movement, and we assume that this specific set of traits must have come from one specific place. We want to believe in a first dog, a pioneer that started the whole lineage. We want a narrative that has a beginning, a middle, and an end. But history is rarely a straight line. It is a messy, sprawling network. When we talk about the Border Collie's past, we often frame it within a familiar, neat narrative. A British working dog refined by farmers, shaped by selective breeding, and finally fixed into the breed we recognize today. It was a satisfying explanation because it felt complete. One origin, one region, one path from utility to identity. It allowed us to catalog the animal, to give it a pedigree, and to box it in. But ancient DNA rarely respects these stories. We've compiled the full breakdown of these genetic patterns in our Ancestry Deep Dive Guide. Link in the description and first comment. It's the perfect companion to this video. Let's look at what the remains actually tell us. When researchers began comparing old skeletal remains with modern working dogs, they found signals that did not stay within one border, one valley, or one breeding tradition. The evidence kept pointing outward. This suggests that the breed didn't emerge from a single point, but from a hidden web of exchange and selection that history largely ignored. We have spent centuries romanticizing the lonely shepherd and his loyal, isolated dog. We painted pictures of solitude, of dogs developed in the dark, rainy hills of the north, disconnected from the rest of the world. But DNA tells a different story, a story of migration, of trade, of constant movement. It suggests that the ancestors of your Border Collie weren't living in an isolated bubble. They were part of a massive continental network of working dogs that were being traded, swapped, and bred across borders long before the Border Collie even existed as a concept. The mystery here is not just about the dog, it is about our own arrogance in assuming we knew the story. We built a mythology of purity, but the biological reality is a tapestry of diversity. Why are we so afraid of the messiness of history? Why do we fear that our dogs might be a product of many, rather than a masterwork of one? This is the paradox we must solve today. The tension between the story we love and the reality the science demands. To understand why the DNA reveals such a complex picture, we have to step out of the modern show ring and back into the past. We have to understand the brutal, unforgiving reality of the shepherd on the border hills. This wasn't an environment for pure breeds. It was an environment for working solutions. On the border hills, where the ground broke into wet slopes and narrow, jagged passes, a shepherd could not afford a dog that moved by instinct alone. The dog had to be an extension of the human will. It had to read a hand raised half an inch, a whistle lost in the wind, a pause in the body before a command was even spoken. Some shepherds prioritized obedience under pressure, while others simply needed to get the flock home by dusk, regardless of the terrain. Out of those local priorities came dogs that looked related, but were not identical. This is where the first contradiction begins. If the Border Collie came from one tight founding line, why do old descriptions keep circulating around different kinds of herding dogs, from different places, with slightly different jobs? Why do early mentions of working ability sound more regional than breed-like? We are talking about an era before the internet, before kennel clubs, and before the obsession with phenotypic uniformity. The sheepdogs of the 1700s and 1800s were functional machines. If a dog could do the job, it was bred. If it couldn't, it wasn't. The borderlands were a melting pot. It was a transit zone. People were moving livestock for markets in England, Scotland, and even across to the continent. Every market was a genetic exchange. A shepherd might trade a dog for a ram. A farmer might bring a dog home from a distant county because he heard it had a better nose. This wasn't a closed ecosystem. It was an open-source genetic project. The shepherds were the original bioengineers. They didn't care if the dog was a purebred. They cared if it could save their livelihood in a storm. When we look at the historical context, we see that the obsession with a border collie brand is a very modern invention. The dog itself, however, is an ancient reflection of human need. The DNA does not erase the border story, but it refuses to let that story stand alone. It turns out that traits like speed, focus, and sensitivity were not gifts from a single ancestor. They were tools. They were survival strategies forged in the fire of competition and climate. The historical record shows us a landscape of constant change, yet we have retrofitted it with a static, frozen idea of purity. Understanding this context is the key to unlocking the true potential and health of the breed today. When researchers began to look more carefully at the records and the remains of sheepdogs in Britain, the picture stopped being so simple. The borderlands were never sealed off from the rest of the world. Livestock moved, people moved, dogs moved with them, and with every movement, the possibility of another influence entered the story. The genetic evidence is quite stark. When researchers compared haplotypes across maternal and paternal lines, they did not find one clean signature that could sit at the center of everything. They found blends, repeated blending, overlapping contributions from British herding stock and neighboring European working populations. In other words, the border collie looks less like the end point of one ancestral branch, and more like the place where several useful branches kept meeting. Think about it this way. Evolution isn't just about the survival of the fittest. It's about the survival of the most useful. In these pastoral communities, if you had a dog that could control a flock on steep ground, you didn't care about its pedigree. You cared about its work. If a dog from a neighboring county had a better way of holding the line, you crossed your dogs with it. You shared bloodlines. You created a network. This is why the data keeps pulling us toward multiple regional networks. If you want to see the complete data map of these migrations, check the link in the description. You'll get the full breakdown, the methodology, and the list of traits that define these populations, all in one place. The scientific methodology here is crucial. Researchers used advanced sequencing techniques to look deep into the nuclear DNA, moving beyond the simple mitochondrial markers. What they found was a level of diversity that contradicts the purebred narrative entirely. There is evidence of gene flow that spans centuries. We are looking at data that shows us how different herding phenotypes, the eye, the crouch, the sudden burst of speed, were being developed in parallel, not in isolation. These were distinct solutions to similar problems. The science suggests that what we call the border collie today is actually a synthesis, a successful amalgamation of various regional herding types that were brought together not by a single breeder, but by the functional requirements of the landscape itself. When we look at the genetics, we are seeing the fingerprint of adaptation. Every time a dog was selected for its ability to work a difficult flock, it was selecting for a complex combination of genes that had been tested and retested across different populations. The evidence is not just in the bones, it is in the very structure of the breed's behavior. We are looking at a genetic mosaic. A tempting explanation is that the breed was simply standardized later, and that the older mixture only became visible once modern testing opened the archive. There is some truth in that. Breed clubs and kennel records did help freeze a working type into a recognizable identity during the 19th and 20th centuries. But that explanation only goes so far. Standardization can fix a name. It cannot invent the deeper architecture already sitting inside the genome. The genetics suggest that the dogs were doing the mixing long before the paperwork arrived. When we look at the genetics of responsiveness, the ability to switch between pressure and restraint in an instant, we aren't just looking at personality traits. We are looking at functional responses to repeated environments. In the ancient record, the same pressures seem to have acted in different places, on different dogs, over long stretches of time. The border collie looks less like an accident of refinement and more like the end point of repeated adaptation. What looked like a local British type may have been built from older stock that had already crossed borders long before anyone tried to write a standard. The border may have given the breed its name, but the work itself may have gathered support from much farther away. The genetic discovery is profound because it challenges the concept of breed-specific genetics. We often talk about border collie genes, as if they are a locked vault of exclusive traits. But the DNA suggests that these traits are widely distributed. They exist in various herding populations across Europe. The border collie is not an exclusive owner of these traits. It is an expert curator of them. It is the dog that brought them all together in the most efficient, effective way. When scientists looked at the specific sequences associated with working ability, they found unexpected connections to continental herding breeds. It turns out the border collie shares a surprising amount of genetic heritage with dogs that lived hundreds of miles away, in landscapes that looked nothing like the Scottish hills. This shatters the isolationist theory of the breed's development. It proves that the border collie was a success because it was adaptable, genetically and functionally. It wasn't about guarding a fence, it was about integrating the best traits from a vast, interconnected European herding population. This discovery changes everything we know about the history of working dogs. It forces us to move past the superficial labels and acknowledge the deep, complex, and collaborative history of these animals. It is a story of integration, not segregation. Does this shift in history change how you view your own dog? Before we look at the future of the breed, take a second to hit the like button and drop a comment. Are you surprised by how connected these early dogs really were? Your take helps this research reach other owners. It should. If the breed was shaped by a network of working dogs rather than one isolated source, then preserving it today is not just about maintaining appearance. It is about protecting a long history of functional diversity, behavior, and resilience. That matters for health, for temperament, and for responsible breeding decisions. It also means the old language of purity is less useful than the language of continuity. The history of the border collie was never a straight line. It was a series of crossings, selections, and quiet refinements that kept the best work in place while the rest of the story stayed hidden. When we understand this, the dog becomes more human, not less. Its history is not a story of flawless purity, but of care, adaptation, and continuity. Shepherds kept the dogs that could read distance and motion. Rural communities preserved the animals that worked with fewer commands and more instinct. Breeders later stabilized those qualities, but the foundation had already been laid across centuries of practical selection. This changes how we approach breeding. Instead of focusing on arbitrary standards of appearance, what a dog looks like, we should be focusing on the genetic health and the functional capacity that this ancient network of dogs provided. We need to rethink the purebred dog industry. By prioritizing the purity of the bloodline over the function of the dog, we have inadvertently narrowed the gene pool, leading to health issues and behavioral decline. The science is telling us that our ancestors didn't worry about purity. They worried about performance. They were functional breeders. Today, we need to return to that mindset. We need to value the genetic diversity that made the border collie the world's premier herding dog in the first place. The history of this breed is a success story of diversity, and our future strategy for preserving it must reflect that reality. If we continue to isolate the breed for the sake of an idealized standard, we might lose exactly what makes it so special: its adaptability, its intelligence, and its resilience. This is a call to action for every border collie owner, breeder, and enthusiast. Let's look beyond the pedigree certificates. Let's honor the true ancestry of this dog by protecting the qualities that allowed it to survive across centuries and borders. The dog is a living record of human history, and we have a duty to keep that record alive and healthy. It is not about keeping a line pure, it is about keeping it alive. By the end of this investigation, the border collie is no longer easy to describe with the old reductive language of origin and purity. The ancient DNA has done something more important than point to a single birthplace. It has shown that the breed is part of a much wider, grander working dog history, one built through movement, exchange, and a relentless, centuries-long selection for function. What looked like a neat lineage now reads like a long conversation between dogs, landscapes, and the people who depend on them. The border collie is a record of human memory as much as it is a record of genetics. It proves that the most familiar things in our lives can carry the deepest, most complex histories. A breed can look modern and yet be made of old, interconnected crossings. It can seem local and still belong to a much larger world. And perhaps that is the quiet power of this discovery. It does not just tell us where the Border Collie came from, it shows us how much history a single working dog can hold, and how easily a simple, comforting answer can give way to a far more profound and human truth. Before we wrap this up, I want to hear from you. Does this shift in history change how you view your own working dog? Does the pure line argument still hold weight for you? Or are you ready to embrace the complexity of the true story? Drop a comment, hit that like button, and let's discuss. The community debate here is exactly what drives the research forward. Subscribe if you want to keep exploring these hidden histories with us, and share this with a fellow owner who needs to hear the truth about their dog. Because the next time you see a Border Collie working a field, you won't just see a dog. You'll see a legacy of 1,000 years, a dozen regions, and a network of history that is still walking right beside us.